Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Monika Skonieczny, and I am the manager of the Trottier Institute for Sustainability in Engineering and Design, also known as TISED. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our next TISED talk titled Tracking Corporate Actors Across Space and Time. TISED Talks is a speaker series that we started here in the Institute, and it is made possible thanks to the generous donation from the Trottier Family Foundation. Before we begin, on behalf of TISED, I would just like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which the peoples of the world now gather. Just a quick housekeeping note before we get going. If you have questions and are joining us online, feel free to enter your questions in the chat, and we do have someone monitoring the chat. At the end, we will have a chance to read your questions. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor Benjamin Goldstein is an assistant professor of bioresource engineering, where he leads a lab for sustainable urban-rural futures, also known as SURF. The SURF lab develops methods to measure and map the environmental impacts of cities, both inside and outside of the urban centers. His research interests include urban food systems, urban resource consumption, and the corporate supply chains that underpin the modern urban life. Prior to joining McGill, he was a postdoctoral research fellow at University of Michigan and received his PhD in management engineering from the Technical University of Denmark. He completed his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering at University of Toronto. Please join me in welcoming him to this talk today.
Cool. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, a fellow chemical engineering alumni from U of T. So it's a good way to start things. And thanks for coming out and taking time out of your busy days to hear me talk about something that might seem a bit esoteric or a little, out of left field for an engineering professor, but bear with me, and I think you'll hopefully get some insights out of it. And again, I'm interested in urban sustainability, and as I was studying urban sustainability during my PhD and my master's, I was doing a lot of work on urban food systems and urban agriculture, and really the findings of my work was that urban food systems, really most of the impacts come from outside the city. And so when I went to do my postdoc, I actually thought about how we could connect the city to the elsewhere from which it pulls all of its resources and causes environmental change. So I think that this is a good slide to start with, which is showing you global trade in 2015. And you can see all of these different flows of materials and goods being shunted across thousands of miles and crossing oceans and borders. And they're going to final destinations where they're being consumed, and it's very difficult to see actually where they come from and the environmental change that results from that consumption. And really there's this huge disconnect between spaces of production, as you can see here, this forest tract, and spaces of consumption. And I had to add the Amazon symbol this morning because we're in a new era of digital consumption, right? But still, the places where we get things from and the places where we actually consume them are vastly separated. And the connective tissue between these two spaces is actually, the global supply chains that underpin our global economy. So how can we make these connections, and why is it important? That's what I'm going to try and impress on you during this talk today. So first, why is it important that we have an understanding of global supply chains? Well, frankly, we live in an era of corporate giants, right? If you look at these individual corporations here, which are listed, you can see that they are equal to or larger than whole entire groups of different countries, right? You can see Microsoft is as big as 8 Eastern European countries. Apple itself is about half the size of the Russian economy, right? And these are just single economic entities. And so they are pulling vast quantities of materials through their supply chains that are causing this environmental change, and that makes them critical fulcrums of change for more sustainable consumption and production. So how can we use this massive economic clout towards environmental and social good? That's really what I'm trying to understand here. So just to take one example, we can think of Coca-Cola and their global rankings in terms of material consumption. Coca-Cola itself, the single company, is the #1 purchaser of sugarcane on the entire planet. They are the #1 purchaser of aluminum on the entire planet. They are the #2 purchaser of glass, and they are the #4 purchaser of coffee. This is one company that controls vast quantities of resources and commodities, and therefore probably has pretty good control or ability to change production practices, not just for a few thousand farmers, but millions of people that are reliant on their supply chains. And so if we can get Coca-Cola to change what they're doing and to realize maybe some of the negative environmental change in their supply chains, that can be a way to lift up not just, their own suppliers, but potentially entire sectors or industries in the global economy. So I like to say, with great corporate power comes great responsibility. And I think it's honestly very true, because we can see environmental depredation and degradation is just continuing at a faster and faster pace, and we really need to get a handle on this if we don't want to blow the planet's fuse. Right? So, take one example. Amazonian deforestation. There was a nice global compact signed to restrict deforestation from soy and other agri-commodities in the Amazon. That was signed around 2010, and it was actually pretty successful. You could see pace of deforestation in Amazon and related biomes slowing down, but it has come roaring back, as this 2021 article, or 2017 article, sorry, would suggest. There were political changes, but also just, again, a lot of companies let this global compact that they signed lapse, and once again, we have increasing rates of deforestation. So who's causing this, right? What's happening? And this is just one example of how we can use new supply chain tracking techniques to actually understand and ascribe responsibility for this type of environmental change. So difficult to read, but you can see here on the far left, these are different biomes. It's the Cerrado and the Amazonia, and then it shows the actual flows of soy going from these different biomes to individual companies that are exporting from Brazil to other companies located all over the world, and then eventually ending up in China, Brazil, South Korea, Spain, everywhere else. So it's basically a Sankey diagram, a material flow mapping of where soy is coming from and where it's going to via these huge corporations, actually. And then on this, and I suggest you check out this website. It's called Trace. They even can link these companies then to their deforestation risk. Trace.earth is the link. So, companies have a hand in this type of environmental change, right? And we need to be able to compel these companies to change their behavior or help them. Change from within and change from without. I would say, I would hope that these companies would be doing the hard work to actually make their supply chains more sustainable, but I'd say the evidence is not in support of that. And so we need to have change from within, where they actually make the decisions, and we also have to have change from without, where we compel them. And that's what a lot of NGOs have been doing, right? You can see various NGO reports showing how environmental change and social change is linked to corporate supply chains. And these are called brand activism campaigns. The point being that hopefully we can damage their reputation enough, or give them the threat of damage, that there are also boycotts and they lose some of their money or their standing, and there's a hit to their revenue, like hit them in their wallet where it hurts. And this can be actually pretty successful. For instance, in response to all types of different reports showing the links between soy deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia, you get all these huge companies like Unilever, Migros, AAK, and the Malaysian Palm Oil Association working together with WWF to actually make something called the Sustainable Roundtable on Palm Oil, which is dedicated towards more sustainable palm oil consumption and production. And really, palm oil is in everything. If you don't know it, it's in your toothpaste, it's in your hair products, it's in everything that you have and eat, tens of thousands of products. And Indonesia was the 4th largest greenhouse gas emitting country on the planet in 2014. Do you think that's because Indonesia is incredibly rich and consumes a lot? No. They were burning forests and peatlands to plant palm oil, right? So this is important, very important stuff. And so you can actually use these brand activism campaigns to push companies to make multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, and then you can get all of these big companies on board, and hopefully, yay, we clean up palm oil, right? We've compelled these corporations to do something good. They sign on. They say, we're only going to source from RSPO-certified plantations. Problem solved. And then, you have WWF going in and making scorecards where they monitor all of these different companies' commitments to the RSPO and how well they're doing. And hopefully everyone's getting a better and better scorecard. You can also make other companies look bad that aren't part of this. And so you can say, compare the good ones to the bad ones, and hopefully, again, twist those recalcitrant actors into actually changing their practices. It's problem solved, right? Unfortunately not, because even if they are signing these types of multi-stakeholder initiatives, who's actually monitoring that they work, right? And they do have practices in place to monitor it, but the research shows that it's often not enough to actually keep deforestation, forced labor, and all other types of unsavory practices out of these supply chains. So here you can see an article from not too long ago. Is the RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, completely worthless or just mostly worthless, right? And you can see again, the RSPO fails to deliver on environmental and social sustainability. And then even in academia, we can see that people are mapping and showing that certified sustainable palm oil still overlaps with high value conservation forests and all other types of biodiversity hotspots that we want to maintain. So we can't necessarily expect companies to clean up their own acts. And even if they do, we need to monitor it to make sure that it's actually happening properly. And then in the absence of that, you can even go in and good old regulation still works. There's something called the U.S. Lacey Act, which means that companies in their supply chains, U.S. companies cannot have environmental crimes embedded within their supply chains. Poorly enforced, but it has teeth, and you can see sometimes they actually go in and make sure that this is being followed. So you have an example here of Gibson Guitars, one of the largest guitar manufacturers, actually having lots of wood confiscated from one of their factories because it actually came from deforested areas in Madagascar that were protected. So what happened and how did this happen? It was actually because, again, NGOs tipped off the U.S. authorities, and then they went in and actually said, hey, not good. Let's stop that. But, the crux of all this is that you have to know where things are coming from and how to map supply chains. And a lot of the time we don't know how to do that. Even the biggest companies often do not know who is their second-tier supplier. They know who they buy from, but they don't know who the people they buy from. And they don't know who the people that those people buy from. Onwards and onwards, right? So we need to have transparency in supply chains. We don't have to fetishize transparency. It's not the only way to make supply chains sustainable, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. And so that's what I'm going to present to you here. Some of the work I've been doing with my colleagues at the University of Michigan, University of Hawaii, University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm trying to think of the places they're all spread out now, on how we can actually make supply chains a little bit more transparent with a method we call tracking corporations across space and time. I called it time and space there, but space and time. It's called TrackCast. That's how we pronounce it, just so we have something, nice little snappy way of saying it. So I'm going to walk you through TrackCast and how we do it and show that it's complicated to track supply chains, but feasible. And it hopefully will be a potent tool for different actors, including corporations themselves and academics, to try and, again, use these supply chains as levers of change. So, again, what is a supply chain? Well, let's step back. It's really the interlinked corporate actors who move goods through the global economy and figuring out where their locations are through the life cycle of a good. So here you can see a shirt made in Gap actually can come from lots of different locations doing lots of things. You have everything from cotton production in India to manufacturing in the Middle East, to consumption in North America and in Europe. So how do we actually sort of make these types of interlinkages visible? And so we pulled from a bunch of different research strands. There are a lot of people that are interested in supply chains. They have different ways of thinking about it, but we pulled from the supply chain research, from industrial ecology, which is really the home of, if you know, carbon footprints or anything like that, that's where it comes from, is this weird little subfield that I happen to call home. And civil society, so NGO advocacy. So we pulled a bunch of different ideas to try and build a method that helps us map and conceptualize and understand supply chains and figure out where we can actually change those supply chains. And the goal really of TrackCast is to do a few things. We want to be able to collect data in using multiple different types of approaches to connect those data to develop what we call internal linkages between different actors in the supply chain. So those are the actual actors that are trading goods and money with each other in the supply chain, but also to figure out the external linkages, because often these actors are embedded within broader social networks where they act that also influence their supply chain performance and activities. For instance, you can think of Russian timber loggers who go and do illegal harvesting of timber. Well, they do that based on getting sanitary permits illegally from corrupt forest officials. All right? So these are different connections. The forest officials aren't in the supply chain, but they certainly have an impact on that supply chain. And then we want to look all of that information and combine it to figure out what the hotspots are of social and environmental change across the supply chain, and then figure out who actually has the leverage to make that supply chain more sustainable, what we call the key nodes. So the broad goal is to reveal those linkages between corporate actors, determine where they operate, make those linkages and hotspots. And so we do this through a 4-step methodology. I'm going to walk you through, and then we'll show you a few different cases very quickly. So step 1, we want to scope our study. Step 2 is collecting that data. Step 3 is identifying and verifying corporate actor linkages. And then step 4 is really looking at the change on the ground and who can affect that change. All right? So I'll walk you through all of these with little examples. So first thing we want to do is actually define what we're looking at, right? What are we going to be studying? You know, and oftentimes this can be, I want to just know flows of wood coming from Madagascar, or you could say, I care about Coca-Cola because they are the #1 purchaser of aluminum. So you might choose a product or a commodity or something that you want to follow. And this is going to dictate then how you actually get your data. All right? You might want to investigate an issue. Again, I might want to just be looking at deforestation in Madagascar, which will then tell me what product I actually need to look at, which would be mahogany. And then once I know that what I'm looking at, I have to figure out how it's actually talked about by the people that work in supply chains. And we use something called the Harmonized Series Codes. This is really the lingua franca of global trade. So when countries want to track what's being imported or exported and they want to charge tariffs, they use the HS codes because these are agreed upon through international conventions about exactly what we call things when we trade them. For instance, you can see that I'm looking at mahogany wood. It has HS code 440723. And it has a very, 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 very precise description of it. And you can go and look this up, publicly traded available data on UN Comtrade, and it'll tell you exactly how much of 440723 is being traded and who's buying it, who's selling it. It doesn't tell you the supply chain actors, but it tells you the different countries involved. So you can use this to start really figuring out what your supply chain structure is and where that supply chain is acting. All right? So I know what I'm looking at, I get my HS code, and then I want to determine the different value-added processes in that supply chain, the various actors that are actually involved in that supply chain. So taking my example of Russian wood, I can look at and figure out where that there's a logging process, a distribution of those logs, it gets turned into floorboards, and then it gets sent over to the final retail phase of the supply chain. And so if I want to connect those together, I actually get my HS codes for what the raw timber is that's coming out of these Russian forests. If I know what types of logs they are, it's oak and ash. And then I know what types of floorboards are coming out and ending up in my final market, which is coniferous flooring and non-coniferous flooring. I can actually then start using this data from various public sources to reconstruct my supply chain and see where I need to gather data and what types of data I need to get. And so using this thinking, we were able to construct actually 6 nodes in the supply chain for Russian timber heading to the United States. So we have different people involved in the logging, the concession holders, the people that actually own the land, the logging companies, the exporting firms, that are exporting from Russia to China for floor manufacturing, and then those floor manufacturers that actually send onwards to the United States. So we know what our supply chain looks like. We decide how much of it we want to look at then. So in our case, we actually want to go from the forest to the floor. Or maybe we're just interested in factory to the retailer. I only want to see, which companies are selling nasty stuff. Or maybe I want to see actually where the final consumption is going to. So all of this plays into how you're actually going to play and collect your data and what geographic scope you're going to be doing. So this is all going to be important in terms of figuring out what data you need. All right? And then temporal scope is, of course, important. So I might be looking at from the forest to the floor, from Russia to the United States, and then I want to look at everything after 2010 or everything after 2015. And that might, again, relate to some environmental issue. Maybe you know that deforestation really ramped up after 2015. So maybe that'll be what your temporal scope will be. So it's about trying to figure out how we can use our data to make a tractable study, right? So now we identify our sources, and there's so many cool data sources out there now. We're living in like a world awash with data. So how do we actually just connect all that together to build a supply chain? I'll show you. First thing is to build the supply chain linkages. There's something called shipping manifest data, which is amazing. You have to pay an arm and a leg for it. I don't know, $12,000 a year or something like that. It's not too bad. But it will give you data on individual shipments at the company level for multiple countries for all of their trade. There's something called Panjiva, which I would suggest you check out. And you can go and look and you can look up Nike in their database. It'll show you how many millions of products they've sold. You can look at individual shipments by the date, by the destination country, by who they're buying from. And this can actually help you start building linkages in your supply chain. And these companies often don't even know this data is available. So you can catch them with their pants down because they really don't know that you're actually... I remember we were doing a study and we were talking to some suppliers of beef, and we were able to name some of the people they were selling to, and they were like, how did you know that? We're like, oh, I'm not going to tell you. So, because they can actually ask to have their name removed from the data. So that's the crux of it. So we just don't let them know too much. So, and then for domestic trade, it's a lot more complicated. People really track international trade very well, right? Because countries want to charge tariffs, right? Domestic trade, once it's in the country, they don't care. So it's a lot more difficult to find your supply chain linkages within a country. But you can use reports. You can actually use financial disclosure documents as well. I've used Bloomberg Terminal, if you know that one. That's whenever you see stock, whenever they show pictures of the stock market, some guys in New York with 10 screens in front of them. They're on Bloomberg. And you can actually use that. You can look up a company and click on their supply chain. They'll show you who their relationships, they call it, but it's their supply chain. It's super cool. Now that one costs $50,000 a year, so that is an arm and a leg. I don't know if the business school, they do have it here. I know they have it here actually. Yeah. So try and beg them to use it. And then once you're trying to find environmental change, that's a little more tricky. Sometimes you have like media reports saying like, this company did this. You have like a mining company, and then you can use that trade data to connect it to some company in the areas of final consumption. You can also use legal proceedings. You can use, what are they called, 10K reports, financial disclosure documents. Or you can use remote sensing as one of our favorite. My colleagues and I, we use remote sensing a lot because you don't have to go into the field. But ideally, you could also go into the field as well and actually just document it yourself. But that, again, can be dangerous and also takes a lot more time. And then social disruption, dislocation. If you're thinking more about social issues, you're going to try and find interviewees, find media reports again. And this is a cool little website you might want to check out. It's called the Environmental Justice Atlas. And actually it shows all types of environmental crimes that have been documented all over the world. You can click on them and it will tell you, the companies that are involved, what the crime was, what the status of that crime is right now. It is crowdsourced, so buyer beware, but still very cool database that you can play with if you want to maybe look up a company and see if they're listed in there and start to use that to dig towards certain issues. So then you got to validate and clean your data. So you have to make sure you have enough data to actually do the thing you want to do. Not always possible. You need to remove redactions. Redactions are, again, those companies that have removed their names from those trade data. So sometimes you lose a big chunk of your data based on that. And then you have to correct your company names. Often companies will use pseudonyms and have all types of misspellings in the data. So you have to correct for those. Use machine learning or whatever. There's so many ways you can do it by hand if you want. But this will help you get more completeness in your supply chain coverage. And then if you're trying to do external linkages, because a lot of the external linkages are going to be more through media reports and not through like the really sexy trade data I was talking about, you're probably just going to have to do text analysis or talk to people trying to build those linkages. But you can see here, just as an example, again with my Russian flooring, we had Russian forest concession maps. I don't know how my collaborator got that. He was in Russia for a while working with NGOs. I don't know, that's not going to be easy to get, let's put it that way. But he was fortunate to have those, and it told you which Russian forest concessions were owned by who, and sometimes the Russian concession holder and the Russian logging firm were the same one. That's why I have that little dash box around it. So we can make that initial connection between those two nodes right there. All right, it's a link between those data sets. And then we had customs data between Russia and China, that shipping manifest data I told you about. So I could actually see which one of those Russian logging firms were also Russian exporters and link them to Chinese manufacturers of floorboards. All right? And then I could use Chinese US customs data to look for links between those manufacturers in China and importers in the United States. And then finally, using company websites and reports, I could link those importers in the US to the final retailers in the United States. So really, using a whole mix, jumble of data, we could make those links from the Russian forest to the US retailer. And I'll show you some of the results of that in a bit. So we make our links, and you have to actually verify it. You can get into some legal trouble if you say things that aren't true. And academic trouble as well. Don't lie. So, you know, sometimes you can actually verify these linkages because companies like to talk about their, they often, if you're like a manufacturer and you supply to Nike, it's, maybe you have like a, what's it called? Non-disclosure agreement, but sometimes, you know, often they like to brag. They'd be like, oh, we supply to Nike, right? And so you can actually look up on their website and you'll see, oh, this factory supplies to Nike. Great. They've told you already. You've got like a link. And then also you can, again, go in, maybe actually go visit some of these sites. So that's what my collaborator did. In Russia, he went to Russia, looked at where the wood was coming from, then he followed the wood, to Chinese factories. He went to the factories, and lo and behold, uh-oh, what logo is that? It's an IKEA logo, right? Somebody's got caught with their pants down because this was coming from illegally deforested lands. They knew that my collaborator followed the wood. He was with Russian forest rangers, looking where the deforestation was happening, and followed the trade actually to these factories and could show, oops, that's not a good look. And then we can actually look at those, identify those hotspots once we've made those linkages and feel confident about those linkages, all right? So, a lot of colors here. Long story short is that we actually overlaid those forest concessions maps over maps of protected areas and intact forests in the Russian Far East, where you have endangered species living, and you should probably be protecting that very rare biome. This is one of the last places where the Siberian tiger lives, right? It's a place that we should be paying attention to and trying to protect. But you can see actually that these forest tracts overlap with those intact forests and protected areas, right? And then finally, we can actually show and identify those key nodes that are maybe culpable in this type of environmental change, right? So you can see here, we actually mapped out the supply chains of Walmart, Home Depot, and Lowe's back to those Russian landowners. And you can see the size of the bubbles, how much that trade of wood that firm is making in total, and then those arrows is how much trade there is between those different firms. So we don't know exactly how much from, for instance, the taiga landowner is going to Lowe's? We don't know exactly, because this company here, Mercury, is blending wood from different suppliers, and then this company here, the floorboard manufacturer, is actually blending wood from different exporters. So it's a whole jumble. We can't really say with certainty, but we know that there is a risk of deforestation and environmental change in that supply chain. So let's just go into a few other examples now of how we've used this method, and hopefully we will be able to wrap up in a nice amount of time so that we can talk a bit. So let's talk about natural rubber from Sri Lanka to the US. All right, we'll focus on one company here. This is one of those examples where we focused on one company, Laland Rubbers Limited. All right, that is a company that is implicated in some problematic practices. They're implicated in land grabbing of 3,000 acres of forest in south central Sri Lanka. They are implicated again in clear cutting that, agroforestry, to turn it into monoculture rubber plantations. So we're really having a hit on biodiversity. We are having a hit on soil carbon emissions as well. And we also know that they are disturbing wildlife patterns because they're putting up gates and fences around their plantations, which is again causing charismatic megafauna such as this Sri Lankan elephant not to be able to go where it normally would go and used to go. So thinking through our track cast steps, let's start by mapping that supply chain. All right? So I look at my Comtrade data and I look at, okay, who's Sri Lanka exporting to? Their rubber. Where's their rubber going? Okay, some of it is going to Europe, but the biggest single one is the United States. That is the biggest single export market for Sri Lankan rubber. All right? And you can see in what form, if I use this data, what form it's taking. Minimally processed means sort of raw commodity rubber. The red means finished goods. It's actually been manufactured. That could be gloves, it could be prophylactics. It's often tires, to be honest. Right? And then we can start building our supply chain. We figured out that there's these 4 basic steps that we could break it down into. There's the raw material extraction, there's the manufacturing, which is often the processing into usable rubber, which then is turned into these final goods, distributed, and then retailed. So we can figure out where that happens. We know that this part of the supply chain is happening in Sri Lanka, and then that second half is happening over there in the US. I mean, there's other countries, but let's focus in on the biggest importer. So let's collect our data. What did we do? Well, we used what we called these ex situ approaches of secondary data gathering. We used those bill of lading data, which is just another way for saying shipping manifest, import-export records, that really crazy data set I was talking about. We use company reports. I also even use some Bloomberg and FactSet. FactSet is like Bloomberg, but cheaper. So if you want to, that's another good thing. So you can use it again to build supply chains. And then we did remote sensing. So all the top 3 we used for building our supply chain. The bottom one, we did remote sensing to actually look at forest change from intact forest to rubber across the rubber producing regions of Sri Lanka. Whoop. So we also talked to some people in Sri Lanka. We didn't do surveys and we didn't visit sites because of COVID. We had some grand ambitions, but things just got set back. So let's actually identify those linkages, all right? Using our data, we could first use company reports to build linkages between Laland and its largest manufacturing partner, which is Eco-Latex. Eco-Latex then trades to the Futon Shop, which is a big futon brand in the western United States, Sweet Sleep in Boulder, Colorado, and the Wolf Corporation in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And then we can see that this is going on to, well, the Futon Shop itself is a large retailer, but you can see Sweet Sleep is selling to prominent brands like the Ace Hotel. If you go to the Ace's website, they try and brand themselves sort of having a sustainability bent. So this is a little bit hypocritical of them. And then you have the Wolf Corporation, which is selling to all of these very well-known retailers, except for Sears, rest in peace. And again, we can identify more linkages. We used our data to actually connect individual rubber manufacturers to large-scale tire suppliers to the United States again. And some of this is actually via Mexico as well. So we were able to make some extra linkages there. And it's a pretty messy figure, but these lines just show you the different connections. The width of if they're really thin, that means we couldn't actually ascertain the volume of trade. But if they're thick, that shows you we actually knew what volume of trade was happening between these two different companies. And again, this is being connected to Sri Lankan natural rubber producers more broadly. So this snapshot was for one company, and this one is more just for Sri Lankan tire manufacturing exported to the United States. And we wanted to look at the supply chain impacts, which is happening around here. One thing that we can consider is actually going back to that case study of Lalane over here. I'm jumping back and forth, but thinking about this supply chain. If this is coming from deforested land, we have to account for that deforestation, actually, that would happen. So these are the different carbon impacts of the manufacturing of rubber coming from that type of deforested land. And actually, you can see that when we modify the land use, we have a completely inflated carbon footprint relative to your average rubber. So your average rubber is down here. Per kilogram of rubber I want, that it's about 3 kilograms of CO2. But if I'm deforesting land, you're up to about 20, right? So we're looking at like a 5-6-fold increase here. So something that we should be paying attention to, and that these companies that want to be sustainable and often have nice pledges in their corporate responsibility documents about sustainability, maybe they need to take more seriously if they're going to be sourcing from companies like this. Now let's look at the actual land use change. Here you can see we've actually mapped different transitions from intact forest, which you see on the left, to rubber plantations, which you can see on the right. And we map it across all of South Central Sri Lanka, where much of the rubber is being produced. And you can see land cover change shown as red up there in that top right one map up there, coming from rubber. So rubber is creeping incrementally into the forests of Sri Lanka and causing deforestation. It's chipping away. It's not like, you can't see huge tracts being cleared, but it's just like sprinkled like salt and pepper. And we can actually see that when we overlay where that rubber is deforesting forests, it's actually in key biodiversity areas and world protected biodiversity areas. And so again, the companies that are sourcing from Sri Lanka really need to start thinking about how they are contributing and can hopefully help decrease forestation in countries like Sri Lanka and other places where they get rubber from. And I talked about palm oil, but rubber is the second largest driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia after palm oil. So let's do another example. We have beef supply chains in California. Right? And beef is problematic for a lot of reasons. We actually looked at particulate matter from CAFOs, from the large confined animal feeding operations in California, because you have tens of thousands of animals put together. They create tons of manure, which is what you see on the top. Each cow produces 120 pounds of manure a day. All right? And so that has to go into huge lagoons. That goes into your groundwater, causes drinking water problems. But also particulate matter is something that causes all types of respiratory and cardiovascular issues for the people that live near them. So our goal was to map these supply chains, understand who's being impacted by this environmental change. And we focused on Costco, but really the reason we did that is because there's only 4 companies that control 3/4 of beef production in the US. And so we actually used a whole bunch of different data sources, I won't get into in detail right now, to link Costco, which is the retailer at the bottom, to this company called the Harris Ranch, which is actually the largest beef producer in Western United States. And they actually have a vertically integrated supply chain that we could map out. We could figure out all of the different, they own all of these different stages of the supply chain. We can map them out and show actually that most of the production for Costco is happening in the Central Valley of California, which is awash with air pollution. And then a lot of the consumption, which is these small black dots, is happening in urban areas. So thinking about how to connect that urban and that rural. And we asked the question, who's actually living near these spaces of production and who's being impacted by it? And lo and behold, when we looked at neighborhoods near spaces of production, the feedlots, and those that are far away, so the blue is neighborhoods that are further away from feedlots, and the red is neighborhoods that are close to feedlots. you can see that those that are closer to feedlots are more likely to be Latino and to have higher poverty levels. So again, this is maybe a little off topic, but thinking about environmental justice. Really the idea that environmental change from supply chains is being concentrated in specific locations, and it's being heavily burdened by people of color and marginalized populations. Again, Costco and Harris Ranch can maybe think about this when they talk about corporate sustainability, instead of lobbying for deregulation of air pollution, actually, in California, which they have done in the past 10 years. So again, putting your money where your mouth is. And then identifying key nodes. We actually did interviews with different people in these supply chains and identified which actors in that supply chain had more power to actually cause positive change for various environmental outcomes. So you see greenhouse gas emissions and land use and air pollution up here on the top. And the size of the bubble tells you how powerful those different actors were. As voted by their peers. So again, we can use this to try and figure out who has control, government and regulatory agencies, but they also said it's the processing plant owners and the feedlot owners. So this gives us a way of trying to identify those key nodes and maybe work towards more sustainable supply chains. Last example, very quick, will be about avocados from Mexico to the United States. And here you can see the border between an avocado plantation, the copious amounts of water it uses, and the forest that used to be there before that. And avocado consumption has tripled since 2005 in the United States, and this is having impacts in Mexico in terms of both land use change and also gang activity. So we did map the supply chains from Michoacan, the only state of Mexico that is allowed to export to the United States for sanitary purposes, and we mapped their supply chain from Michoacan to the various ports, all the way to the end consumer cities, actually. And we were able to link avocado production in Michoacan to various exporting groups, to the U.S. importers, and then eventually to the U.S. retailers, such as Kroger. If you ever lived in the U.S., that's a huge retailer, Costco, Walmart, all that. So again, we did land change analysis, and the red shows you where avocados have deforested high conservation value forests. So problematic, again, because this is actually one of the only places in the world where the monarch butterfly stops when it's going from North America to South America. And so if we cause large deforestation and land use change here, there might actually not be a path for that migration to continue in the future. So think about that when you're buying avocados. Again, we've mapped it with those conservation areas and shown again that the avocados are growing where those conservation areas are. So very last thing, I'll wrap it up in the next few minutes, 3 minutes. Our next steps, inside and outside. I've shown you how we've used some novel data sources to connect supply chains to environmental change. And now I want to show you, maybe how we can use this data to move to something called, a more sustainable economy for people and planet. And so I put up Small is Beautiful here, one of my favorite books, which sort of talks to you about how we can imagine a different type of economy and maybe how we can think about that as impacting the supply chains that are currently causing challenges everywhere. So for me as an academic, I'm interested in using this type of data to understand how urban consumption is related to environmental change elsewhere. That's one main question I'm working on. Another one is trying to understand the processes that cause supply chains to congeal and for durable relationships to occur, because this is exactly a very fancy picture. What it's showing is actually palm oil trade from Guatemala to Mexico to the United States, different actors involved in their level of embeddedness, so the durability of their trade relationships, and showing actually that RSPO, the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, actually causes trade relationships to become more durable between companies when they are RSPO members, which maybe talks about the different processes that can hopefully lead to more enlightened environmental governance. Because if they have more durable relationships, that maybe gives more time for them to actually work together towards more sustainable palm oil, as opposed to those who are just working through market transactions and changing their different suppliers all the time. It's sort of hard to really build a strong environmental philosophy around that. So these are the types of things I'm looking at. Same thing there, no need to to hash that one out again. So what we hope to do with TRASCast is to allow researchers to link corporations and brands to environmental and social dislocation and change. Hopefully we can use this to actually start publishing this stuff, not just in academic journals, but on public-facing websites. And then we also have plans to collaborate with media and NGOs. We have ongoing conversations to try and mobilize companies, consumers, and states toward meaningful change. And they need to, right? They need to. And this does work, actually. Again, showing you data from Trace. This is them tracing different types of flows of soy to companies all over the world. And in response to this, a lot of these companies have now said, you know what, we actually, because they were caught with their pants down, have made pledges again to start paying attention to deforestation more seriously. And they need to, because supply chain laws are coming everywhere. The European Union just passed the European Supply Chain Act in 2021, which is going to actually require companies to have wall-to-wall supply chain traceability across their supply chain and all their suppliers. So not only is it going to be bad for these companies in terms of reputation and maybe a bit of sales from boycotts, it could also mean legal peril, right? And these are just different companies or countries that have actually either supply chain laws in place or have planned to put them in place. So it's coming. The regulatory landscape is changing. Unfortunately, companies are really stuck over here with trying to figure out their supply chains. They're setting up traceability protocols and they're sort of getting to know their suppliers. But they only, like I said, know their first-tier suppliers and not who's supplying their suppliers. So there's so much work to be done. And there's a lot of talk about blockchain and how that's going to be a silver bullet, but really scalability is not there at the moment. Maybe in the future, but not there at the moment. And even Nestle, who is the real champion of blockchain for supply chain sustainability or traceability, only has done 1 or 2 different trials on their chocolate supply chains. So that's a proof of concept, I suppose. But to get wall-to-wall traceability through blockchain is going to be quite it's probably not, more than a decade away. It's like fusion. So that said, I just want to thank my collaborators over here from various schools in the US, and you know what? I'll end it on that. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a bit of time for questions, if there's any in the room. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question, and then I guess I have 1 or 2 follow-ups. The first one is just in general, it looks like this is more of a method by which you can trace supply chains. It's not necessarily like you have a larger database that you could query, for example. Okay, so it's pretty much TRACAST, is that correct?
TRACCast.
TRACAST? Okay. So I'm interested because you said also tracking through time. Have you taken any look at temporal evolution, for example, of how supply chains might change? Did I miss that? And have you had any impact? And then the last one being, how can you, this is your next step, how can we try to, because with beef, for example, this is a big challenge. How can we try to convince people not to eat avocados? Because, the questions with beef and sustainability, and I'm not a full vegetarian, I make choices, but it's a big challenge in terms of people who enjoy specific foods. So that's the last question. So first is tracking through time, and then the follow-up regarding how do we actually encourage change in the fact that there's some demands that are less or more elastic, per se.
Yep, impact. How do we have impacts? So this is an example of a study where we actually look through time. Because like I said, we're looking at durability of supply chain relationships. So durability implies that we're looking at whether they stay static or are dynamic, right? And so this study, even though you don't see it here, we looked at supply chains, took different snapshots from 2011, 2015, and 2019 to see what the supply chains looked like and how durable they were and if connections were being made, forming, or disintegrating. So we have looked at that, and that's how we could actually test whether companies that were RSPO certified were actually more durable than those that weren't, because we did look at their relationships over time. So it is possible, but it certainly hasn't taken this, like the time aspect hasn't taken the same level of focus as the spatial component, because that's just, often we're considering where the impacts happen more so that's where the space becomes more central. And then the impact question, I mean, I wish I had an answer to that if I did. Like a satisfying answer. My go-to is to say that I don't like putting the blame on the consumer, to be honest. Like, I really think that it's a lot more on the companies that are making record profits. It's the onus is on them to actually change their behavior and work towards more sustainability than individual atomized consumers. And I think that that's sort of, it's almost like a red herring in our neoliberal times to expect, like, billions of individual people to collectively, do the right thing. I just don't. I think it's tough. So I try to make people aware of how those connections happen, but I don't point the finger per se. And it's nice to know and think about what's happening where you buy what happens with your avocados and where they come from. And the U.S. sucks all the avocados from Michoacan. I think all of our avocados come from Peru mostly, and that's why they're hard and not as good. And so again, long story short, I don't want to put the blame on individuals, but maybe getting the prices right. I sound like an economist, right? Trying to incorporate some of the externalities into the price. We're not paying the full price of our food, even though inflation is pinching people. I mean, we're still not paying the environmental costs, certainly. So maybe that would change people's purchasing. So, any? Yeah.
Question, the same kind of comment. Then are you perhaps pushing more for like a regulatory framework? Because then companies won't, by definition, they're there to act for profit and not for a greater. But they don't have any personal responsibility, so it's either on a consumer or us through the state to force them to act the way we want to.
Yeah, I think ideas of what a business can and should be are evolving, and that this whole idea of purely profit motivated at all other and ignoring all other costs, I think that's changing, and people are thinking, but okay, so we can get into a debate about how the narratives about what a sustainable business is and how that's changing, but I think regulatory frameworks are definitely where we're going to have to go, because these companies have had plenty of time to clean up their act, and they don't really show an inclination to do so. You can just look at the greenwashing by the oil industry right now, like BP is saying, oh, beyond oil. And then like 2 weeks ago, they're like, let's go get more oil because the market conditions dictate it. So I don't have any faith in companies to do the right thing, to be honest. So good old regulation can do stuff. We still live in a world with states, and the owners of those corporations have passports and are beholden to certain states, and they can be punished. And I think we should probably be looking more at that direction. But people hate sticks and they like carrots, and I like sticks. A bit of a masochist, though. What's up?
There's a question online. George, if you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask the question.
Yes, hi, thanks. I want to just understand a little better. Well, first, I admire the project. Thank you. I want to ask a question about how you make the link between, for example, that Sri Lankan company and the deforestation in the forest. If your first capture or your first trace of that company is in the shipping manifest, how do you actually connect it specifically to that forest?
This one, let me see here, deforestation. Over here, this one we have the link for Leland. This one we have the link. We know it's been reported in the media, right? And we know where they're. They have actual maps of their rubber plantations. But for these ones, we don't have that link, and that's why I was careful in what I said. I said there's the risk of deforestation for these other companies here. For this one, that one, I said risk, and they should be concerned about it. But we do not have any concrete evidence that they are leading, that their plantations are these ones over here, that are the red dots that are causing deforestation. But I'd say the onus of proof is on them largely. I mean, if they can make billions of dollars, then I think that they can spend a few $100,000 to actually map their supply chains. So yeah, but good question. So I maybe I wasn't absolutely clear, but I try to parse out where we have the data and where we don't. So we don't have those actual linkages here. Neither do we for the avocados at the moment. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
So I have a question about the UN guiding principles, which would be an overlay on the legislation that you've been looking at. So the logic of the whole thing is risk analysis, risk management, and then a sort of a sliding scale of responsibility based on cloud. So
Mhm.
the things that you are, these are three of the many things that you're providing information into on. So I gather that each one of these is an incredibly time-consuming and resource-intensive process. So I can see this feeding into the legislative frameworks at domestic, regional, and international levels perfectly. I guess it's just a question about scalability and making this certainly not available in real time, but I also think that for the purposes of the legislation and the governance frameworks, you don't necessarily need to provide evidence of very firm linkages of each step along the way. It is sufficient in a lot of these cases to provide evidence of risk, and then the ball is in the court of the corporation,
Mm-hmm.
including in many cases under legislative standards, but also under the supply chain management protocols that they've voluntarily signed up
Mhm.
to or created themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I mean, I think risk is enough to show that it's, and that's why the Sri Lankan example is exactly that, which is okay. We know it's happening. It's happening because of smallholders who aren't very well documented to begin with, and they trade to village rubber traders, who then it gets agglomerated and connected to all of these larger manufacturers. Some way we don't know. It's very murky. So, again, I'd say the onus is on the companies to actually show that it's not coming from these types of places, as opposed to us proving that it is coming. It's nice when we can, because I think that's ammunition that we can use forcefully, but again, I have very little sympathy for multi-billion-dollar corporations that are profiting immensely and then say they don't have the time or money to go and actually figure out where their stuff's coming from. But they do have the time and money to squeeze those suppliers as much as possible to lower the price of their incoming goods. So I just I don't know, maybe I'm showing my political stripes or something, but I just do not have. That's my philosophy on it and my ethical framework that I apply to it. But yeah, it's certainly not a perfect method. The more scalable method is definitely trace.earth. Look at it. Check it out. They are definitely a much bigger player, and they are much more working with the corporations and with particular corporations and with governments and NGOs. But again, they use that exact framing. They look for risk. They show you where the municipality that the soy is coming from in Brazil, showing you who's exporting it. Then they don't know exactly where it's going after that. They do some controlled conjectures, and they have really fancy images that make it look like they know where it's going, but they don't actually. But still, they can show which companies have risk in their supply chains. There's also other companies, like this is turning into a big field, right? SourceMap, if you know them, just look it up, supply chain traceability companies. If you can get into this, you can probably make a lucrative living. And there's some cool job opportunities coming down the pike, I think. Because companies need to know.
Do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, sure.
So there's one comment online, so I'm just going to read it.
As long as they're friendly.
Yeah. So the TrackAsk is impressive, but how could we use it? How could we use this information to force these giant corporations to be more transparent? Sometimes the companies do not know their supply chain fully, as you alluded. Probably transparency does not happen because their idea is to maximize their stakeholders' shares. Apart from regulations, how could they choose the sustainability path, or how could we encourage them to?
Well, people could stop buying their products, but I mean, but that hasn't really worked out. I mean, these brand activism campaigns have shown, like the ones I showed at the beginning with deforestation, linking it to different multinational corporations. It does take, there are studies that show that these types of campaigns can have a bit of an economic hit on the companies, but it doesn't necessarily lead to sector-wide change generally. You know, who remembers Rana Plaza? Remember? No? Yeah, it was that factory in Bangladesh that crashed down, I don't know, in 2014. There was a lot of talk about like eliminating sweatshops from the supply chain and all these companies signing on to voluntary agreements, and you know, a lot of very dramatic gesturing, but you can look at the statistics. You know, forced labor is only going up, not down. So I don't think these, and you know, and a lot of these voluntary initiatives were again because of these companies being legitimately scared that people would walk away from their products, and maybe they did for a month or two, but not too long enough to really put them out of business or force them to really change their practices. So I think legislation is going to be, you know, why do we have a weekend? Because of legislation. The companies didn't say, oh, you guys can have Saturday and Sunday off. You know, like that wasn't voluntary. We had to force, so we can have large scale change. We just have to remember that governments can do good things and they have lots of power. So I don't think the individual consumer is going to do it. So I think regulation is going to be the one that does it, really. That's my personal opinion.
Joining us both here and online, and I'd like to thank, again, the Trottier Family Foundation for their support in making this event possible. And if you guys are interested in what TISED does, you can always look us up online, sign up for the newsletter, and we'll hopefully see you at our next event. Thank you again.
All right, thanks so much.